Anyway, so we have a Professor Alexander Webb, who is a professor of advanced design, construction practices, and associated professor of emerging technologies at the University of New Mexico in the US. He's an architect, and he's one panelist now in the panel, which is about the importance of agency. In his case, agency in the architecture, and I understand that he will be talking about the role of AI in terms of benchmarking the basic elements in the development of urban and architectural structures and concepts. And I would like to start to introduce his speech with a short comment made by somebody commenting the Alphagos moves. So when the AI basically defeated anybody around, somebody made a note. It's not a human move. I've never seen a human play this move. It's so beautiful. So I think that that's the introduction to the last presentation of an architect, and we'll be happy to listen to Alexander, and then we go ahead into Q&As and wrap up. So Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to present to all of you today, especially following so many impressive presentations. Really, this is quite a collection of work that I'm very very impressed to be presenting with. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to offer some thoughts today about the role of agency within architectural AI, both the architectural AI design process, and this can extend to other forms of the use of AI within a design process, as well as our AI in terms of being a component that's interacted in or embedded within a built environment. Some of the themes I'll bring up have been touched on today, but I'm hoping to posit some questions and really provoke a discussion relative to some ideas that I'm still wrestling with myself, and I'm curious to have your thoughts on. I think it's important, but when discussing agency, to kind of narrow the definition somewhat. It's sort of an ambiguous term and has quite a lot of definitions for a noun. But in this sense, I'm really talking about agency in terms of the capacity of acting or inserting power, in this case, directly within the built environment, whether that's within a design process to determine how a built environment is arranged, or within the built environment itself and actually rearranging it dynamically, adaptively, or so forth. And I think another caveat I should offer is that I'm really approaching this from a perspective of sustainability. I think, given the nature of the built environment and the urban environment contributing so much to carbon emissions, that really this is an area that is ripe for discussion in terms of what tools can we integrate in order to combat climate change. And while I'm very interested in the performance of buildings, I think it's worth noting that I don't necessarily see that high performance buildings are the only way to respond to climate change. There's a whole myriad of provocations that we can make as designers, both with architectures and with objects, but with in terms of creating awareness, in terms of seducing inhabitants to use a building that's slightly more sustainable through the compelling aesthetics. There's really a whole host and range of options that we have at our dispersal. And I fear that when I invoke a perspective coming from climate change, I might come across as an engineer who's interested in sort of building performance optimization. And I want to stress that that's really not my perspective here. But I think it is worth noting that much of the integration of AI into the built environment has really come from a position of addressing sustainability. The smart city model for integrating AI. It was really an attempt to be able to track user location and modulate resource use based off of their location. So if someone was leaving their apartment and going to an office, the city would sort of know that and adjust the temperatures in the different spaces accordingly. This never really proved to be realized, even though that was the intent, and that's largely by design. The idea was, if the smart city was constructed, it would essentially be a large sensor array, whether it was a greenfield smart city like Songdo or Masdar City, or a sophisticated retrofit such as Chicago's Array of Things. Basically, there would be a whole host of information collected into a central server or central server farm that then the information would then be presented to humans, and humans would determine what to do with it. And this was so divorced that that humans would be would actually build the capacity to respond to the information in the later phases of smart cities. So in many smart city projects, there aren't the actuators or muscles that sort of correspond to the nervous system that collects the information and feeds it to the kind of the smart city's brain. And I think that given the model of the smart city, it's a really compelling framework in which to start looking at how we're typically using GAN within a design process. We're very compelled by the images of Deep Green. There's incredible work, some of which has been shown today, of how designers are utilizing GAN to sample and remix images, and it's continuing with it's a very natural extension of much of architectural design, starting with postmodernism, which is kind of blowing up and exploding ideas of architectural semiology, through deconstructivism, blobarchitecture, computational design. There's a strong lineage of moving away from architectural convention and architectural elements and reconstructing on logics that are unique to a different kind of approach or a different sort of idea of performance. And these are ideas that Stanislav speaks about in his writing, Neil Leach writes about as well, that there's this kind of asset that the computer provides that has no knowledge or framework of how humans see architectural sign, and completely explodes and works beyond it. And it's interesting to me that a lot of these kinds of suggestions that GAN produces are referred to frequently as hallucinations, whether that's also something that Neil Leach refers to, but also interactive artists such as Rafik Anadol, who terms many of the titles of his work and to include the term hallucination, that this idea that the machine is seeing something that is not there, that is not present, and then manifesting it that as in kind of a new kind of possibility, the product of a machinic psychosis. And this is a really fascinating idea that we're utilizing this tool to provide solutions that are products of a kind of either a hyperactive imagination or an imagination that skews reality and dream. And this is certainly active and present in many architects' works. Gauzel's persuasion machines creates a dynamic virtual environment that's dynamically reconfigured through these kinds of hallucinations. Span's Robot Garden takes these kind of ideas of architectural sampling and recreates them and uses them to be able to question notions of ceiling wall interfaces between the two, and kind of explode ideas of how those elements might formally relate. But I think another aspect of GAN's use that I find very interesting is the role of the machine as sort of a versioning agent. So my understanding in terms of a lot of these writings is that effectively the machine will produce a range of options from which then the human designer will select. If that's the case, that's certainly consistent with lots of computational designers. People like John Fraser and Akim Menges have historically described the use of computation with an architecture being very different than other disciplines. And other disciplines will frequently use the machine as an optimization process to basically reduce and focus a design relative to a specific kind of performance. Historically, many computational designers will use the machine to basically open up a range of preferences, or a range of possibilities, that then they're able to determine which one is the most effective, compelling, and deploy and develop from that standpoint. And I find this very interesting because it seems to me to be very akin to the same model of the use of computation within the smart city. So if in both of these systems, the machine is either producing versions or producing information that then the human determines a course of action for the design that then gets deployed or built, whether through computational mechanisms or conventional methods within the built environment itself. And I'd like to offer that that's not the only model, that there are indeed other models. One in particular is a model that's offered by Cedric Price and John Fraser, along with Julia Fraser, in their Generator project. This was a speculative project, and they proposed at the end of the 70s for a family in Florida that had such distinct and different and rigid programmatic constraints that the team felt that there could not be a singular design that could respond to all the needs that this family had. So what they proposed was effectively an adaptive architecture. The machine, there would be programmatic cubes that would be laid upon a grid. There'd be plenty of space within the grid so that a computerized crane could pick up the program cubes, place them, rearrange them, and then redeploy them based off of user need at the time. What I find incredibly interesting about this project, and this might be one that most of you are familiar with, so I apologize if I'm refreshing memories at best, but being repetitive at worst. But what I do really appreciate about this project is the capacity for the machine to get bored. Price and the Frasers felt that there was a distinct possibility that the users would kind of get bored themselves with using the machine and kind of come to like a mediocre meh solution that would just kind of and just leave it there and not bother to use the crane anymore. So they suggested that the crane would get bored, and if that a layout remains for long enough, that the crane would actually start moving the different program cubes around the grid, despite any sort of requests or despite the lack of a request from the human users. It would just on its own start reconfiguring the architecture to basically make sure that there wasn't a sort of mediocre stasis found. And in this sense, this is a very different kind of model, that there's a human production in terms of a framework of a grid, of program cubes, of structural systems, of an agency of a crane, a reach span of the crane. But then the machine is then deployed to be able to reconfigure and actually create a myriad of architectures within that given framework. And this is a model that designers like Ozel would continue with. Ozel's cerebral hut, also like a Nuke's EEG headsets, would actually track the neurological activity of the users. In this case, not responding to muscular tension, but actually looking at the neurological wavelengths of the users and responding to their level of focus. That would change the rate at which these pistons would undulate within the cerebral hut. So another framework that the humans create, but then the machines are responding to certain kind of information, but dynamically reconfiguring the architecture at a very, very rapid rate. Similarly, Jenny Sabin's ADA project that she did for Building 99, or Microsoft's Building 99, isn't a dynamic architecture in the sense of having moving pieces, but as dynamic in its use of light and color. It collects mood information from the residents or the staff of Building 99, and effectively reflects their mood via color on this large installation in the atrium. So even though it's not formally dynamically reconfigurable, the lighting is dynamic and relative to a whole host of data information that's being prompted by the human users. And I think that this is particularly interesting, an interesting model given the advent of or the catalyst of Alphagos Move 37, which was missed by Arnost in the beginning. This is a really seminal moment. Alphagos challenging Lee Sedol, who's effectively the best Go player in the world. It makes Move 37, and it's received as a mistake. No one sees the value in it. No one sees the benefit. It's surmised that the machines will never beat humans and humans will reign supreme. But Move 37 turned out to be a complete. It ended up winning the match. It was a move that the machine saw value in, but humans could not, because it was coming from a different kind of intelligence and a different kind of logic. It was spawning an agency that was demonstrating how the machine could see things differently and add value to complex systems, whether it be Go match, climate change, urban dynamics, whatever, that there is a capacity for the machine to intervene. And I find that this model is far more similar to what Cedric Price and the Frasers were suggesting than how we are currently using GAN, where instead of where in the case of GAN, we are typically utilizing this kind of versioning process that we then select from. But if we're in a position to select benefits or select a design, even when we might not be able to understand the benefits, we are limiting the capacity of the machine to act. Now that with aesthetics, this is sort of a little bit of a non-issue, right? Because we're kind of generating interesting capacities. But I think that we frequently use aesthetic formal investigations to seed larger discussions about more complex and robust systems. So I'm offering this observation in the hopes to kind of foster discussion relative to when we ask GAN to do more, how will we ask, and how will we enable the machine to be able to make Move 37s relative to climate change? But to do that, I think we have to answer a very fundamental question first, which is, are Gans visions, are there hallucinations, visions of things that are not there, or manifestations of things that we cannot see? And I think when we go back to the image of Van Gogh's self-portrait, it's sort of a laughably easy answer. Of course, there are not hummingbirds and turtles and whatever else in Van Gogh's self-portrait. That they're not there. He did not paint them. But I want to offer up an alternative technology that I think frames GAN in a really interesting light, which is Adobe Photoshop's Find Edges filter. For those of us who've been using Photoshop since the beginning, we'll know that Find Edges has been there. It's from the beginning. It's kind of an OG filter. It's very much integrated with Photoshop. In fact, there's a period of time where really every architecture student used the find edge filters to take a mediocre diagram and blow their critic away with it. It's something that's sort of familiar to us all, but what's an interesting capacity of it is that in the 90s, a team of microbiologists from Cal State wrote a paper describing how the find edges filter was a productive alternative to photographing microbiology than treating film. So with the current technique for being able to see aspects and features on cellular skin was this incredibly laborious, time-intensive, expensive process utilizing film and film developing. This team found that they could actually scan images into Photoshop, use the find edges filter, and be able to accomplish the same sort of results. So it was this process where the filter was actually detecting information that was there, but we couldn't see. And I think it's interesting to really ask, given that lens, are Gans visions really things that aren't there? Could they just be conglomerations of pixels that respond to and invoke, if amplified and magnified, animal faces, facade elements, whatever else we're seeding the GAN image bank with? And could that potentially be a shift that might be more productive towards giving or finding the value within GAN having an increased agency within the design process? Another aspect of this is, and I'll only touch on this briefly, but the issues within contemporary philosophy, get particularly ideas of the post-Anthropocene, and as other presenters mentioned, the post-human, that if we are to undertake the project of giving the interaction of fire and cotton the same footing as our interaction with cotton, our interaction with fire, and our interaction with fire and cotton interacting, then in some ways that's actually a challenge for us to actually see the value in Gans hallucinations as being something that is in fact very real and as something that is as valuable. And if that's the case, that really pressures this notion of versioning and pressures this notion of us being the selector or the critic, the curator of the most optimal idea, but actually allowing GAN to actually be able to have a greater capacity to make maybe not as significant as a move as Move 37, but smaller, important moves within the built environment and within the architectural design process. And I'll leave with this thought. I think this clearly posits far greater, far more important questions. How could we possibly undergo that project while keeping humans in human life safe? How do we create a degree of agency within a machine that then it doesn't sort of that doesn't subvert the progress we've made with kind of establishing a machinic agency? And I think that in thinking of that way, I mean, I effectively am working on a dissertation that's basically addressing how to do that. But but to sum up, I think what this calls for is actually a shift in habit of mind. Rather than seeing a machine as something that we prototype and perfect outside of a context, but then deploy within a physical context, that we actually see machines more like children. Like, we don't take a children out of the world, give them all the coaching, and then put them in the world and expect them to be perfect. We place children in the world, we expect them to fail, we encourage their successes, but then we give them constructive criticism along the way in terms of how to navigate such an exceedingly complex system, which is effectively the physical world and the cultural world that we've created. I think that in doing so, we're actually I think if we were to do that, we would actually be following a model that some of the earlier presenters suggested in terms of testing AVs in situ and actually allowing them a capacity to respond and react to different kinds of conditions, but broadening that to reach a greater range of different kinds of built environment AI, as well as AI within a design design process, to be able to engage and respond to these calls of the post-anthropocentric, as well as the precedents given to us from AlphaGo. As I said at the beginning, I'm very interested in continuing this conversation. Please feel free to email me at this address. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. I'd also like to apologize to the first half of the presenters. I'm coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and while there was once a time I probably could have started my day at 1 a.m., that was about 10 years and 2 children ago. So I apologize for missing the first half of the presentations, but it was a delight to see the second half. Thank you all very much.
It somehow fits into the whole day, even though you were not with us. And there's several questions I'm thinking about. I'm checking the Q&A. Nobody is brave enough to ask, and in the chat, I don't see anything so far. Me and Lenka, we would try to react to what you just told us. I would have a first question, because I said I'm a biologist. My first degree is in biology, and you interestingly referred to sustainability. My question would be if you expect the solutions to not only to come from this hallucination, for example, but basically we need solutions where, for example, architecture reacts to the climate change somehow. Is it in a power of one not one, but maybe a group of architects to come up with a relevant framework or requests for the buildings or for the urban solutions? I mean, you said that we need these basically extra human solutions, but how we do get to them? Do we have to engage more of a physicist who have no clue about architecture and biology, or what might be the mixture? Because there might be several different disciplines hallucinating to get a proper questions. That's my question.
Oh, that's a fantastic one. I greatly appreciate it, because it really speaks to a lot of the issues we've had with addressing sustainability to date. Really the way to respond to issues in terms of new construction was to create rating systems. Either we have LEED here in the States. The Living Building Challenge is another one. But what we found, I mean, as architects, is that effectively the Living Building Challenge is impossible to reach in New Mexico, because there's such a dependency on collecting water from natural sources, and we simply can't do that. So effectively, what that does is that creates a metric where that is almost ignored, because people don't value it or don't see it as something that they can actually respond to. LEED is problematic for a host of other reasons as well. And I think one of the things that is actually suggested by biology is effectively the architectures that animals create are so incredibly contextual, and that they're so radically different given a different ecology, that an anthill in sub-Saharan Africa is such a different construct than a beaver dam, and should be. And that for our capacity to sort of kind of come together and create a uniform standard frequently falls flat, because it's so difficult to create a uniform standard that then responds to such dynamic changes in context. And I think, to me, I don't see as much potential at this moment in kinds of regulations or sort of self-governance, as much as developing tools that make these things that much more easy. in terms of building performance, I remember as a sort of a young architect working at Gensler, I was, twisting my designer's arms to try to get all of the environmental analysis software, and it came out at around the time that Ecotech was just did not work, and then we had IES, which I think is a little bit more common in your guys' part of the world. But it's the issue we found was we're like, well, we actually really don't know like what the numbers mean. Like you get all this kind of feedback back about the energy would save this much or use that much, but it's really difficult for us to actually tell if that was good or not. So it's incredibly problematic. It's so problematic that I've talked to, and I won't mention who, but I've talked to several leading figures in sustainable architecture here, and they admit that their kind of simulations, their predictions and building performance are completely flawed and aren't accurate at all. But they don't see that as a problem because they're saying, well, we're just getting closer, and that's we're advancing architecture to a more performative place, so that's what matters. And I have multiple ethical issues with that one as well, but I feel like but I think that that's a natural byproduct of actually failing to be able to create tools and regulations that are actually sufficient, that people are just saying, we're just going to lie, cheat, and steal to try to have an effect. And that in this case, the ends justify the means. And I don't agree, but I understand for sure.
A question from the chat. I can read it. Could you please share your thoughts on how AI can contribute to ideation? Could you use AI to enhance doodling, scribbling experience in order to come up with unexpected forms?
Mike, that is the $1 million question right there. So I am actually one of the worst people to answer this question because I routinely encourage my students to avoid ideation and for actually them to embrace process-based design methodologies, which computers. So it's sort of a self-serving position because I can't yeah, it's sort of I come at design from a very different place, and I didn't realize the value until I was also working at a place like Gensler, where I was working with people that could sketch beautiful perspectives upside down so their clients could see them drawing it, and it was just. I couldn't even draw perspective right side up, much less, I mean, I could, but not nearly as beautifully as them. And so I'm kind of the worst person for that. I think that, too frequently, I think that the kind of conceptual trap, and when we're talking about artificial intelligence, is we almost immediately want to compare it to our own and sort of see it as something that is like us, because that's how we understand intelligence. That's why we value it. We is our own because that's what we do and what we value. Benjamin Bratton has an amazing piece about this that he published in the Times and somewhere else as well, but basically something to the effect of outing AI, that we've actually asked AI to be in drag to present itself as something else, and that presentation is actually subverting AI's capacity to act. So when we're asking Alexa, Cortana, Siri to be able to interact with us like we interact with people, it's such a much low level process than, say, using the Google search, where we've actually developed a really incredible sort of syntax with Google, where you don't say like, what is the capital of Kenya? You'll just say capital Kenya is, or something like that, in this kind of like staccato, non-human form of interaction that Google understands super well, right? So all of that is to say that I kind of feel like machines aren't very good at ideation from what I can tell. And although they're incredibly provocative with GAN, I really appreciate a lot of the work that's happening with GAN. I don't see that as their strength. I see that their strength being much more towards things like resource management, massive amounts of information, huge amounts of data, urban behavior use, things like that is much more their strong suit. So I feel like it's kind of like if you have a design team, you don't ask the mechanical engineer like, well, you know, what kind of structure ideas do you have here? You know, you kind of use the partners for their strengths. And I feel like with AI, in my opinion, the utility of AI is actually outside of the ideation phase. But again, I'm incredibly biased because I personally am not very well skilled with the ideation phase, and I teach my students to not be either. So I'm probably not the person to respond to that. I apologize.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to ask because maybe if we move this to another level, so not talking about using AI for ideation, but maybe could we as humans get inspired by, you know, this continuous interaction with AI tools? And when you were mentioning GANs, and you're a really interesting question whether what GANs are hallucinating, whether it is really something that's out there but we don't see it, or whether it does not exist at all. Maybe this doesn't even matter because it can still maybe be some new inspiration for humans and our own imagination. So I don't know, what is your opinion on this kind of more awake inspiration?
Well, as far as I know, I'm the only American on this call, and I've spent the last 4 years in a place with alternative facts. So this is it's also a really interesting one, and I think, but I think what is actually in some ways more important is so much of us as designers, we kind of deal with. I don't want to come across as being politically affiliated with something I'm not, but we actually deal with alternative facts frequently, right? Someone thinks that the kitchen is the best place for or for some kind of interaction, or the bedroom needs to be on this facade, and we can do all the analysis, and we can handle all the numbers, and then we still, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, like to that person, whether it's a team member or a client or whatever else, a developer, you know, we still have to take that information and hold it and value it. So in some ways, I kind of feel like AI is really kind of a beautiful tool to advance us to really kind of accepting different perspectives, and it gets messy when we get into alternative facts. But it is a really interesting moment in kind of our kind of like our sort of ontological history to be thinking like, well, what is the nature of someone's perspective, and how as designers who respond to that. And really, one of the most important developments in design and architecture, I think, in the last 100 years has been the information superhighway, which has absolutely reframed the role of the architect from being the kind of the master builder as one presented. It's now something completely different, and it's really much more about a networker or a connection maker, or someone that kind of, we're no longer the seat of all knowledge. We're actually the facilitator to all other kinds of knowledge frameworks. And that seems like a reframing that not only welcomes AI, but then also AI sort of accelerates and advances that reframing as well. So I see it as kind of a very productive moment for us as a practice and really as a species.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Alex, the debate is getting more and more abstract, and I think that as we are moving towards moving towards the early evening, so
yes,
after the whole day, we have been preparing for really kind of climax of the whole debate, but I think we have reached the level of abstraction which cannot be easily basically passed at this moment.
Sorry,
No,
guys.
no. It's not. You don't have to be sorry. I mean, I'm just trying to wrap up whatever we really appreciated from your presentation. Your talk it was really great. And what I appreciate is that the kind of, throughout the whole day, there was a series of, the designers. There was a guy who was doing physics, and there were different design but there's a one line which is very clear, and it's the architects actually who are there to comment on AI. And there are probably many different reasons why it's so, because they do the complex stuff anyway, because they ask to solve everything which is impossible anyway, and because probably they also connect many disciplines just technically. So it's not difficult for them to talk to the engineers and get something calculated, because other designers not always would do that. So I would like to thank you. It was really inspirational, great talk. We're really happy to have you here. We'll be happy to keep in touch. We will present your email as you asked to be questioned later on.